Hey Malik, I got a question for you.
Yes.
So you saw my email on the school account, right?
Which one? Did you send a new one or?
The one I sent like 5 minutes ago.
Oh, this one that
Yeah.
led to this video chat.
Yeah.
Yes.
So how come you logged in under your personal account?
I could have used both of my accounts on this computer, so it might have switched it.
Okay.
Give me a second.
Okay. That's fine. I was just trying to figure it out.
Oh, okay.
I'll wait a couple minutes, see if anyone else shows up, and then we'll get started. All right. Let me check something out real quick, Malik. About ready. Whoop, someone else has joined us. That one is here.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
That's all right. You're just in time. So, let's see. Were either of you two here a week ago?
I was out of town.
Yeah.
So, Malik, you were?
Yes.
Okay. So, we're picking up where we left off. We're, let's see, last time we were here, we did Nixon and Watergate up through Reagan. And so we're picking up from there. There's a lot of different things going on in the 80s culturally. cable TV is becoming a bigger thing. So, before cable, you had TV in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, but you pretty much could only get it through an antenna. You didn't have digital TV yet. So, like, if you lived out in the country, it was all snowy. It looked, it was like this staticky look. It's kind of hard to describe if you haven't seen it. But now with cable TV, it becomes affordable, it becomes widespread, so a lot of people are getting it. In the 80s and 90s, this is where you start to get all your different channels, your news channels, your music channels, Nickelodeon, Weather Channel, all of that stuff starts coming out in the 80s and 90s, ESPN. Big box stores become a big deal. Like Walmart, Home Depot, Target, they start crowding out the smaller businesses, which is what some people don't like about them. You have AIDS becoming an epidemic in the 80s. It really freaked a lot of people out early on because people didn't really know how it spread. They just knew it was like killing people, like you were healthy one day, and like, the next thing someone was dead. You had a lot of celebrities die of AIDS in the early 80s, and that freaked people out. Special like like earlier this year, people were freaked out when Kobe Bryant died in the helicopter crash. If a lot of people died quickly who were celebrities, that would shake people up. Well, you had a lot of celebrities dying of AIDS in the 80s, and it shook people up. People didn't really get a grip on how it spread and preventative measures, and you had a lot of stereotypes about what kind of people got it, and that didn't really shake itself out until like the late 80s, early 90s. A lot of the stigma went away when Magic Johnson was diagnosed with HIV, which causes AIDS, of course. So he kind of did a lot to, make that go down. The AARP becomes a big thing. You guys might have seen commercials about them on TV. They're basically a advocacy and political group for the elderly. That was why I assigned a warm-up, which I don't think any of you guys have done, about the voting age and like different generations and how they vote, and the fact that people who are 60 and older vote in very large percentages, or why politicians will listen to older people more readily than they'll listen to your generation or my generation. There are a lot of political changes that go on in the 80s and 90s. For Malik, who was here last time, Isaiah, were you here last time?
Yeah, I was.
Okay. So you remember we talked about Gorbachev. I think I put a picture of Gorbachev on the screen last time. But
Yeah, birthmark on his head.
yes, very good. So he's a younger guy. He's energetic. He says, "Hey, let's kind of change things up. As far as how we deal with our country and how we deal with other countries." And Reagan says, "Well, if you're really going to be a good guy, you got to show it. Actions speak louder than words." And so he goes to Berlin, and remember, Berlin is divided with the wall, and he stands in front of the wall, and he dares Gorbachev to tear it down. He says, "Mr. Gorbachev, if you really are sincere, open this gate, tear down this wall." And everyone kind of went nuts. And so, nobody thought anything was going to come of it. But throughout the 80s, you have people in the Warsaw Pact, the eastern part of Europe, start to think, hey, maybe this time it's different. Reagan is talking about what we're going through. Gorbachev seems like a reasonable guy. because anytime in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, if you rebelled against Soviet rule of your country, they would send in the tanks and crush you. They did this to Hungary in 56. They did this to Czechoslovakia in 68. And so nobody, wanted to speak up, but now it looks different. And so in 1989, you start to get these countries decide to get rid of communism in their country and become a democracy. And earlier that would have been, a very dangerous thing to do, but now they feel safe enough to do it. And so Poland became a democracy in the summer of '89. So did Hungary. Later on in the fall, Czechoslovakia did. And the big thing that everybody remembered was the Berlin Wall came down in November just out of nowhere. There was an announcement by one of the East German government officials that they were going to let people go through the wall. And some reporter said, well, when does that start? He was kind of on the spot, so he kind of just said something without checking with anybody. He said, I guess anybody can go whenever they want. And so you had these giant waves of people just like overwhelm the East German border police, and they didn't want to like kill thousands of people. And so they kind of just let them go through. And pretty soon you had people showing up with chisels and sledgehammers, and then in a few days it was bulldozers and wrecking balls, and by the end of the year the Berlin Wall was literally in pieces being sold to people as souvenirs. So the people in China got kind of excited about it, and because China is communist, and so they started to protest, and they said they wanted to be a democracy, but the Chinese Communist Party is like, nope, we ain't doing any of that. And so they killed thousands of their own people in what we know as the Tiananmen Square massacre. And I don't know if you guys have ever seen this or before, but I'm going to try to show you a picture, some of the pictures of this. Yeah, I can just do it this way. Okay. You guys see the pictures?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. The most famous one is the one. There's a few pictures on the screen of the guy standing in front of the row of tanks, and that was done by a journalist who was secretly filming this. If he had been caught, he would have been in a lot of trouble. But yeah, he stood in front of a row of tanks. That was like the symbol of like, what one person can do against power. But like, you see some of these other pictures, you see like how many people are in these protests, and the fact that they're going to use tanks and machine guns against their own people. It's just, it didn't end well, we'll just say. China's still a communist state to this day, which is, while, if you look at the Cold War, the communists never told anybody the truth. And people who are old enough to remember that are using that, or who know history, say, hey, look, here's another communist country in the year 2020, and why should we trust anything they say about the coronavirus, for instance? So, while all this is going on, Reagan is leaving office. He's had his 2 terms, and his vice president was George H.W. Bush. He's the president who died a couple of years ago, George W. Bush's father, and he won the election in a landslide, which I'm going to show you real quick. Here we go. So, I mean, all that red is for George Bush the father. Pretty much the idea being that Reagan did such a good job for his 2 terms. And if Reagan says, well, I think my vice president would be a good guy to take over, people are going to listen to that. And so he wins pretty easily. the big foreign policy that he does is there you have Saddam Hussein. Have you guys heard about Saddam Hussein or know who he was?
I've heard of him. I'm pretty sure he was a terrorist.
Not totally.
I only heard the name. I don't remember who.
Let me put him up real quick. So this is Saddam Hussein.
Oh,
He was the dictator of Iraq from the late 70s up until he was overthrown by us in 2003. Saddam Hussein, one of the more crazy people of the late 20th century, he decided in 1990 to invade Kuwait. And I'm going to show you what I mean by that real quick. So let me see if I can get a good regional shot. Yeah, here we go. This will work. Maybe. It'll clear up. There we go. All right. You guys see this okay?
yep.
So in the middle of the map, what country are you looking at?
Iraq.
That's Iraq. So if you look down into the right-hand edge of Iraq, where I'm putting my little cursor, that is Kuwait. Small little country, basically no military at all, but very rich. Very rich because it had one of the richest oil supplies in the world at the time. That tiny little country actually made at one point 10% of all of the world's oil. Iraq, much, much bigger, made the same amount of oil. So Iraq's like, hey, if we can take over this little country, we can double the amount of oil we make. And we never liked them anyway. And we have a lot easier access to the sea. So, yeah, let's do it. And so one night, boom, Kuwait was gone. Iraq invaded. And the world said, what the hell are you doing? Iraq said, whatever the hell we want to do. We got the 8th biggest army in the world, and y'all can't mess with us. And so the world, led by guess who? The United States, told Iraq, you better get out of there. Iraq said, hell no, we ain't going anywhere. And by the way, you know, Saudi Arabia right down here looks pretty appetizing because they produced, at that time, half of the world's oil. So 50 plus 10 plus 10, you're starting to get the idea here. And so Saudi Arabia had a military, still has a military, but they weren't ranked 8th like Iraq was. And Iraq actually in the 80s had went to war with Iran and fought to a draw. And Iraq, part of the reason thought nothing was going to happen to them was, remember, we were and are enemies of Iran. So when these two countries went to war in the 80s, we gave Iraq money and weapons to fight Iran. So Iraq thought the U.S. wouldn't do anything. And so Iraq was kind of taken by surprise that the U.S. would react this way. But the U.S. is not going to allow Iraq to just take over the Middle East. And these states in the Middle East don't want to be taken over, and so there you go. And so President Bush, the father, said to Hussein, you better not go in there. You better not do it. We're going to send people in there to stop you from doing it. And so he sent, and this, remember, this is still in the Cold War. The Soviet Union hadn't totally fallen apart yet. They were about to, but they haven't yet. And so the U.S. military at this time had somewhere between 1 and 2 million soldiers. Now it's got like 300,000. So you got all these soldiers just sitting there, right? And so Bush sends 500,000 soldiers to Saudi Arabia, what was called Operation Desert Shield. And then he started working with the Arab states, the French, the British to say, hey, let's not tolerate this. And so they got the United Nations to agree to tell Iraq, you got until day X to get out of Kuwait or else. And Iraq thought they were bluffing. They're not going to attack us or whatever. And so Bush is like, I don't play. And Bush, by the way, was the last president who was a World War II veteran. He was a fighter pilot in the Pacific. And so, he sees the world very much in terms of black and white, right and wrong. And he thought Iraq was an evil country and we're going to go after it. And so you had two generals lead the fight against Iraq in what became Operation Desert Storm, which was to wrap around Kuwait, cut it off from the Iraqi army, and just wipe it out. And it was the fastest war we ever fought in American history. You had I think it was like 100 Americans get killed in the war. You compare that to like any other war we ever fought in. It's very one-sided. You had like entire groups of Iraqi soldiers surrender to CNN reporters because they knew that the U.S. wouldn't bomb CNN reporters. It was really, really one-sided. So Bush had like this really high approval rating. Do you guys see the picture right here?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
So these are the two lead generals of the war. You had General Powell on the left, who kind of led like the planning of, or one of them planned it, the other executed. I forget which is which off the top of my head. And then Schwarzkopf is the other guy. These are both 4-star generals that are shown here. But Bush was really popular. He won the war. It wasn't a very complicated war like Vietnam. The problem was that the economy all of a sudden out of nowhere tanked in 92, which happened to be an election year. And Bush looked like he didn't care about the economy. And so that weakened him going into the election. George Bush is trying to stay president by saying he won the Cold War, he won in Iraq. He is being challenged in 92 by Bill Clinton, a new guy nationally. He was a major figure in Arkansas politics. He had been the governor of Arkansas off and on since the 70s. And his big message was, hey, nobody cares about what you did against Russia and Iraq. People can't pay their bills, and you don't seem to know how to deal with it. It's the economy, you dummy. And so he got a lot of traction that way. What else was ironic about the 92 election was it was one of those weird elections where you don't have two candidates. You had a strong third-party candidate. You had a guy by the name of Ross Perot, who was not a Republican or a Democrat. And he got almost 20% of the vote. And it's very rare for a person who's not a Republican or a Democrat to even get 5% of the vote. This guy got 20% of the vote. And the reason he was able to do so well is because he was a businessman. He was a billionaire running for president. And he said that neither party is dealing with the real problem, which is the debt is getting out of control. And he said, if you put a businessman in there, a businessman knows how to make the books work and balance properly, and all get us out of this flipping debt. And so that appealed to a lot of people. Questions about any of this stuff so far?
No.
Nope.
Okay. So next we'll deal with the Clinton presidency. Clinton's got a lot of different stuff going on, so we'll deal with the domestic stuff first. Does any of y'all remember what it means when you talk about domestic affairs?
Doesn't that mean like the stuff in the country?
Yeah, stuff within the country, correct. So Clinton early on, the problem he's got is he ran by saying he was a new type of Democrat. a Democrat who was from the South and therefore understood that the federal government should be limited in its power and that kind of thing. But then when he came in, he tried to get the government bigger because Congress ran Congress, or Congress ran Congress. The Democrats ran Congress, and he thought that, you know, they should all work together. One of the problems Carter had was he was from the South, but he didn't work with Congress even though they were Democrats. So his own party hated Carter, but Clinton tried to get along with him. So one of the things he tried to do was to get a universal health care program passed, which the Democrats have wanted for a very long time, all the way back to Truman's presidency. And he put his wife in charge of that, which of course is Hillary Clinton. And so a lot of people are like, man, why is he putting his wife in charge of this? You know, what's that all about? And so people didn't like it, and they convinced Congress to not support it. What he did get through Congress was background checks to buy guns. That was called the Brady Bill, because Reagan didn't mention it last time. Reagan was shot a few months into his presidency. He almost was killed, but he was able to survive. But his press secretary was hit by one of the bullets straight up in the head, and he survived, but he had permanent brain damage. So for the rest of his life, he fought hard to get gun restrictions passed, and so they named the gun law after Brady. Clinton also had other problems within the country. You had several terrorist attacks on American soil. You had the World Trade Center bombed. This isn't the one with the planes hitting the buildings. You had the World Trade Center was attacked 8 years before that. You had two Middle Eastern terrorists rent out a truck, like a moving truck. They packed it full of explosives, and there was a parking garage underneath the World Trade Center. So they set up the truck as a bomb, and they left it there. And the idea was that, you know, if you bomb underground, it'll like tear up the support pillars, and if there's nothing supporting the building above it, it'll like tip over like a domino and maybe take the other tower with it. Luckily, that didn't happen, but it caused a lot of damage, and a few people even died. The Oklahoma City building was bombed by an anti-government group. That was a federal building in downtown Oklahoma City. Like half of the building was blown off. And what really sucked about it was there was a daycare inside the part that was blown off. And so you had like 15 or 20 little kids get killed that day. And you also had the Olympics in Atlanta. That was bombed by an anti-government, anti-whatever group. And so Clinton has all these terrorist attacks going on. Also, he lost control of Congress. People were upset with Clinton about the fact that he said he was a new Democrat, but then he started acting like an old Democrat. And people were like, we didn't vote for an old Democrat. What's up with that? And so in 94, you have the congressional elections, and the people voted Republicans into Congress as a punishment to Clinton. And this is the guy who led the Republicans into Congress. This guy here is Newt Gingrich, and he is going to be a very powerful figure for the rest of the 90s. But instead of fighting Gingrich all the time, Clinton was smart. Clinton said, hey, let's figure out some of the things we can agree on, and instead of fighting over things that we don't agree on, let's, work together on what we do. And so Clinton is easily reelected. They work together to balance the federal budget. This is the last time we did not run up debts every single year. And in fact, we actually started to pay down the debts. They worked together to reform welfare requirements. So you had to show that you were either working or looking for work. if you wanted welfare assistance. But this guy impeached Clinton for having an affair and lying about it under oath. Clinton had been investigated throughout his presidency for a shady land deal that he had made while he was governor of Arkansas. So while they investigated that, the investigator kind of took a side trip and said, "Hey, I heard you were, messing around with one of your interns. Was that true or what?" And he was under oath, and Clinton said, I didn't do anything. I don't know what you're talking about. And so the House of Representatives impeached him for lying under oath. It went to the Senate because that's the process. The Senate found him not guilty. Most of them, agreed that he lied under oath, but they said that, what did he lie about? He lied about an affair, and that wouldn't be bad enough in their opinion to overturn an election and throw the president out of office. So that's the second time we've ever impeached a president. We impeached President Andrew Johnson back in the 1860s. So there have been 3 impeachments: Johnson, Clinton, and Trump, and none of those have the president been removed. It reinforces what we said about Nixon last week. You don't remove a president because you don't like what he says or what he does. You remove a president if you can prove that he did something that was a serious crime. And if you can't, then you wait till the election rolls around. Clinton's dealing with a lot of foreign stuff also. There was a warm-up that dealt with that last week. I don't think any of you guys have done it yet. You have Yugoslavia falling apart. That was a country that was in southeastern Europe. I'll show you a map of that real quick. But it got very bloody, very violent, and the U.S. kind of tried to make it less bloody and less violent. Let me show you a map of what's going on. All right. You guys see the map okay?
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, so everything that is colored in this map used to be Yugoslavia. And you kind of see the neighborhood around it. Italy isn't too far away. Greece is down at the bottom. And you got Austria and Hungary up above. So Serbia had always dominated Yugoslavia. These other colors represent other states and ethnic groups. They never really liked Serbia, but they put up with Serbia for a long time. The guy who kind of kept them together died in the 80s, and this new guy was kind of a bully and nobody liked him. And so when all these communist countries fell apart, Yugoslavia was communist, and so they said, hey, maybe we don't want to be part of this anymore. And all of these different states started breaking off. Slovenia broke off. That's where the first lady's from. Trump's wife's from Slovenia. Croatia broke off. You see, they're about the same size as Serbia. And so they had a pretty violent war between them. And they fought inside Bosnia, that green state in the middle that's kind of shaped like an upside-down triangle. And Bosnia got really bloody and really bad. And so the U.S. actually bombed Serbian troops that were killing innocent people in Bosnia. And we got Serbia to agree to leave Bosnia alone, and they kind of split them up between them. Very complicated. And then a few years later, Kosovo broke off from Serbia, and Serbia's like, you aren't going to break off. And so they sent troops into Kosovo to bring Kosovo back, and they did the same thing they did in Bosnia. They were killing innocent women and children. They were putting them in camps like in World War II and starving people and all that. And they called this ethnic cleansing because it sounds better than genocide. And so the U.S. and our allies, the British, the French, the Germans, used air power to bomb the Serbian military again and stop all of this. Clinton is going to try to get peace in the Middle East. he gets a deal done between the Palestinians and Israel early on in his presidency, where the Palestinians promised to stop using terrorism. Israel says, "Hey, that's good. You can start, controlling yourselves. We won't be up in your business all the time. And if you stay on good behavior, in a few years, we'll start, considering giving you guys independence." The country of Jordan in this meeting also recognized Israel's right to exist. And so you have another Arab country at peace with Israel. And so a few years goes by. They have a second meeting, and the leader of Israel tells the Palestinians, "Hey, we're ready to go ahead and give you independence." The Palestinians are like, "Okay, well, what land are we going to get? We want X, Y, and Z." And the Israelis said, "Yeah, we'll give you all of that, but there's this little part here that we want to hold on to. How about we keep that little bit?" In other words, they were going to give the Palestinians 97% of what they wanted at the table. It's like if I go to a job and I say, "Hey, I want $100,000 a year to start," and the boss of this company doesn't think I'm smoking mushrooms, but he actually is going to listen to me and says, "Well, I don't think I can give you 100,000, but how about I give you 97,000?" I'm going to take it. I think you four would take it. The Palestinians didn't take it. They got real mad. They said, "F you, get the hell out. We don't want to be around y'all anymore." Bill Clinton was at the second meeting. He was like begging the Palestinians to stay. He's like, "There's nothing you can do to keep me around." And so while all this is going on, you have Al Qaeda start to become a big deal. That's where you get, Mr. Crazy Man, Osama bin Laden, start to go. You know who he is?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Kind of broke up.
So I was just making sure, while they were negotiating this deal between Israel and Palestine, Al Qaeda is on the rise, and no one was really paying attention to it. And so bin Laden is the leader of Al Qaeda, who you see here. Bin Laden decided to declare holy war on the United States on worldwide television. Nobody took that seriously. So the next year, in 1998, he decided to bomb U.S. embassies in East Africa, which I'm showing you now. You had two embassies, one in Kenya, one in Tanzania. These are about 500 miles apart. They were bombed at exactly the same time to create the most amount of confusion and chaos in 98. And it killed a lot of people, but most of them weren't Americans, because in any given time, you got more foreigners at an embassy applying for visas and permits and all that. So bin Laden was upset that nobody paid attention to it. So he's like, "Well, I'm going to have to bomb something more American than an embassy, I guess." And so he decided to attack a U.S. warship that was parked near Saudi Arabia with a speedboat. This was a suicide speedboat. They rammed into the side of this ship and blew this giant hole in it. The U.S. was lucky this ship didn't sink, but it killed about 12 or 15 people on board. And again, bin Laden was pissed because people didn't pay enough attention to it. He did this late in 2000. And guess what was going on in the United States late in 2000?
Election, right?
Exactly. And Clinton has had his 2 terms. He's leaving office. And so everyone's all excited about who's going to take Clinton's place. And bin Laden's like, "Damn, I bombed 2 of their embassies and nobody paid attention. I bombed one of their ships and nobody paid attention." And so this is when bin Laden starts to plan the 9/11 attacks. Questions about the Clinton stuff so far?
Nope.
Okey doke.
Nope.
All right, so that'll kind of get us into the 2000 election. You have George W. Bush run up against Al Gore. Gore was Clinton's vice president, and Bush was the governor of Texas for 8 years. And so Bush kind of has that on his resume. And Bush says he's going to restore dignity to the White House, implying that Clinton kind of nastied things up, with all of his scandals going on. Vice President Gore said that if he was elected, he would continue the economic prosperity that Clinton benefited from. Clinton offered to go around with him and say, hey, you guys all ought to vote for Al Gore. Now Gore said, no, thank you, Bill. I don't want you around. Because he thought the scandal thing would make him look bad. And you see how close the election is. If you look at this little graph here, the electoral vote 271 to 266. The popular vote 47.9 to 48.4. What really messed the election up was Florida. Florida's always a tough fight anyway. Let me see if I can show you this real quick. So what this is a breakdown county by county across the country. And so what I'm trying to show you is the fact that in Florida you see a lot of red, but you also see a lot of blue. And that happens every single election. Florida's always fought over, and Florida's a big state. So if you can get Florida, you're going to get a lot closer to becoming the president of the United States. The problem was you had these weird ballots in Florida that the old people didn't know how to use. And so this is what is called a butterfly ballot, where in the middle, you guys see this yellow strip in the middle of the ballot?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Underneath that is a little Scantron paper. And what you do is you take like a little puncher and you punch through the hole of the person you want to be president, and then you'll flip the page and it'll move over, and you do for governor or whoever else. So the older people, and you got a lot of them in Florida, couldn't read it. They were looking at it like this, and they couldn't tell which arrow pointed to which hole. Now, you guys are either 18 or probably going to be 18 by the election, so this is important. This is practical life skills I'm teaching you now. If you got a ballot and you don't know what it says or what it means, what do?
Ask.
There you go. There are people who are paid there to help you understand what the ballot is telling you. So that's what these old people should have did, but they didn't. Instead, some of them punched the wrong one. Like you see oh yeah, this is where it really messed up. You see the Democrat thing, Al Gore, number 5, is supposed to go to this hole. If you start from the top, it's pretty easy. 3 here, 4 here, 5 there. But the older people, some of them couldn't figure it out. So they're like, I don't know. Does the 5 go to this hole or does the 5 go to that hole? And so some of them would punch this one, which means they voted for that guy. Some of them didn't know what to do. So instead of asking, they would punch both holes, which means now guess what you just did?
You voted for both of them?
Can you do that though?
It's an invalid vote.
It sure is. But this got so confusing that you had both Bush and Gore sue each other over this election. Gore sued Bush and Bush sued Gore, but Bush made it to the courthouse first. So this court case is called Bush versus Gore. Bush is suing Gore to stop his request to the state of Florida for a recount, because they already did one recount and they found that Bush won, but Gore said, nope, I want another recount. And so the state of Florida said yes. Bush said, "This is ridiculous. We got to figure out who the president's going to be." Because remember how close that map was. And if you take Florida out of the map, nobody has enough votes to win the White House. And so you literally went for 6 weeks. 6 weeks, nobody knew who the president was going to be. You know, you usually wake up the next day like, oh, so Obama's going to be president, or Trump's going to be president, or Biden's going to. Nobody knew. And so Bush is like, we can't be doing this. We got to figure out who the president's going to be. So it got up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decided 5-4. Hey, Bush is right. We got to stop the recount and just like figure out who won this thing. And so when they stopped the recount, Bush had 537 more votes than Gore did in Florida, which means Bush got Florida, which means Bush became the president. But there were 5 million people who voted in Florida. So 537 out of 5 million, that is like, you know, less than a needle's width. I mean, it's like teeny tiny amount. So this is like a reinforcing lesson. Never take an election for granted, because you don't know which state will be the decider in any election, and you don't know how many votes it'll take. So when Bush becomes president, he's like Clinton. He's not paying attention to Al-Qaeda or anything. He says, hey, you know, let's reform education and make educations better for America. Let's make the economy better, because the economy was starting to go down a little bit. So he cut taxes on everybody. It worked for Reagan. It worked for Kennedy. He figured it worked for him too. He also wanted to privatize a lot of the welfare programs. He wanted to privatize Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and let people put that money in their own investments, because a lot of times those will actually make more money for you than just Social Security checks every month. So that's what he wanted. The problem is the world blew up in his face, and he had to deal with that instead. You guys know what I'm talking about?
Refresh might be in.
Okay. So I was talking about this whole thing about Bin Laden's doing all these attacks and no one's paying attention to him, right? What's the biggest?
Yeah.
So what's the biggest attack they ever did?
9/11.
Correct. And so 9/11 in a lot of Americans' minds came out of nowhere, and you had Bin Laden's 4 planes that are hijacked hitting the Twin Towers, killing almost 3,000 people. You had the Pentagon get badly damaged in D.C., and there was a 4th plane that was going to hit either the White House or the Capitol building, but there were people on the plane who heard about the other attacks who stopped that plane from getting to its target. They tried to wrestle control back of the plane, and the pilot, the suicide terrorists, you know, they took the plane down rather than lose the mission. So we go to war against Al-Qaeda. The problem is Al-Qaeda is not a country, they're a terrorist group. But there was a country that was hosting Al-Qaeda. They let Al-Qaeda operate and plan from there. And Bush told that country, you better turn them over. They killed a lot of our people, and the world's kind of pissed, because it wasn't just America who was attacked. The World Trade Center is a World Trade Center. You have people from literally every country in the world in those towers. This was the biggest attack against the British in a terrorist attack, because you had like 150, 200 British citizens die in the towers. And so the whole world was pissed at Al-Qaeda. The world was with us. They wanted us to go get Al-Qaeda. But there was one country that said, nope, you ain't getting them. Anyone know what country that is?
Iran?
Nope, not Iran. You're very close.
Syria?
Nope, not Syria. We didn't care about Syria yet.
Iraq.
No.
No.
that would have been suicide for Saddam Hussein. He was smarter than that. We'll get to
Afghanistan.
Hey, Raul got it. It was Afghanistan. Notice that's why we're still in Afghanistan to this day, 19 years later, because of the whole thing of like, hey, this is where it was planned, and there's still people from that group that are still in there doing terrorist type stuff, and we don't want to just leave them there so they can make a comeback. This is why the war in Afghanistan is the longest war this country has ever fought in, because that's where Al Qaeda was based. And the government there protected them. The government in Afghanistan was called the Taliban. And so the world went to war in Afghanistan to get rid of the Taliban. And then Al Qaeda went on the run and hid in the mountains in between Afghanistan and Pakistan. And that kind of is still going on. The president says, you know, hey, we got to do something to make sure nothing like this ever happens again. Part of the investigation found out that a lot of the spy agencies in the U.S. didn't communicate with each other. So, like, if the CIA knew something and the FBI knew something else, you know, they're like, oh, that's weird. Oh, that's weird. But they wouldn't talk to each other and say, oh, man, this plus this equals this. We better do something. And so the Patriot Act said, hey, you guys need to communicate with each other, and we're going to put one guy over all of you guys to make sure that's going on. We're also going to make it harder for people to hide money in bank accounts, because before you could just walk into a bank and say, hey, I'm Joe Smith, I want to open up a bank account. You know, and terrorists were doing stuff like that. So now it made it harder to open up bank accounts. You have to prove your identity and, you know, that you're not a terrorist and all this stuff. They also made it harder to fly. This is when the government took over security programs at airports. Part of what the terrorists did on 9/11 was on that day you were allowed, I mean, like, not that day, but like forever, you could take your work tools on a plane. Like if you were a contractor working on a construction site, you know, and you didn't want your knives to get lost in the luggage procedure, you could like take your knife with you. And so these terrorists took box cutters with them on the plane, and they used that to, you know, stab people and cut people's throats that day. And so they're like, well, nobody's going to ever put that on a plane again. You know, you can't take scissors on a plane. You can't tape sharp objects on a plane, all because of what these people did. So, you know, whenever kids are like, oh, well, how come the whole class gets punished because this, like, hey, 9/11, I never tried to attack an airplane, and I got to get scanned, and I got to take my shoes off, and all kinds of stuff. So this is where that all gets started. This is also where the government starts investigating people more. The government is looking at people's activities, their bank records, their phone records, their internet searches. All of that is part of this, like, hey, we don't know who's the good guy, who's the bad guy, so we got to look at everybody and check and see. And they created the Department of Homeland Security to kind of oversee all of this. Questions about any of that stuff?
No.
All right. So we'll do the last part of the notes today real quick, and then we'll wrap up. Immigration patterns have changed in the last 50 years. That was another one of the warm-ups that almost nobody has done. In 1965, LBJ decided to reform immigration laws. Congress agreed, where all national groups will be treated equally, and they will be allowed in legally up to a certain amount of numbers each year for every country around the world. I think it was 50,000 per country per year, but I'm not sure. And so what that does is that encouraged large amounts of Hispanic and Latino immigration into the United States, as well as Asians moving into the west coast of the United States. Those are the two largest groups of immigrants in the U.S. since the 60s. Asians, especially in the West, and then Hispanic and Latinos. Those are the new groups of immigrants. By the 80s, there is a problem with this. It's not the legal part, it's the fact that there are people who are coming undocumented. The fact that there are people here who are legal, but you have family members who either want to be with them or they're like, hey, it's right there and let's, come across. And so by the 80s, there was a large number of immigrants coming undocumented, and people were upset because they're like, hey, I only have a high school education. I can't get a real fancy job, but when I go try to get a job, working at a factory making $10 an hour, the job's already gone, and people who are working there, they're not documented and they're working for cheaper, and now I can't find a job. You also have legal immigrants feeling upset. It is very hard to be a legal immigrant to the United States. You got to pass several background checks, medical checks, you have to pay for all of these checks. Then once you're approved, they say, well, we can only let so many in a year. We're going to put you on a waiting list. And then you got to wait your turn to be let in. And then once you get here, you see people who didn't do any of that and they're just here. And you're like, wait a minute, I had to do all of this stuff. I had to wait all this time. I had to pay all this money, and they just to get in like that, that's messed up. And so you have those groups pressuring the government in the 80s to do something about this. And so Reagan and Congress come up with an amnesty program in 1986 that says if you've already been in the country for a long time, you pretty much already fit into America, so you should get to stay. And then at some point you can become a citizen. But if you just got here, maybe, you were kind of just playing the game and you don't get anything. But we don't want more people doing this later, because then we're going to have to pass another amnesty thing, and we don't want to do that. So from 86 on, we're going to strictly enforce border control. We're going to clamp down and have more patrols and send people back when we catch them and all that. And we're going to watch all of the workplaces across the country and make sure they're not hiring undocumented workers, because if you get rid of that, no one's going to want to cross the border. The problem was nobody followed through with that. So in the 90s, people in Latin America are like, hey, they're not enforcing this thing. Let's come back across. And so immigration, undocumented immigration spiked again in the 90s, and each president has to deal with it again and again. Clinton had to deal with it. Bush had to deal with it. Obama had to deal with it. And Obama kind of had a weird way to deal with it. At first he said, hey, the law's the law, and we're gonna have to deport people. And so for the first 6 years, he was deporting people like crazy. And you can look this up and see this. He actually deported more people, in 6 years than Trump has done. But then in the last couple of years, he tried to get the DREAM Act passed, which Congress didn't go along with. So Obama said, well, you know what? I'm going to do DREAM without Congress, and that's controversial because then the president's making up the law, and you're not supposed to do that. The DREAM Act's the idea that if you came to the U.S. undocumented but you were a kid, that wasn't your fault and you should get to stay. And so, they're still debating and talking about that from time to time. Questions about any of that?
Nope.
I hit 2 o'clock
Nope.
on the nose. So that's pretty good. Does anyone have questions about anything at all?
I've been
How many
keeping notes online, so I'm fine.
Okay. You got some assignments to make up still. There's a couple more days worth of assignments and the Unit 8 packet. And I think that's due Thursday, and then it's all a wrap as far as new assignments go. You can still make up old assignments if you want to get your grade high enough to get that GPA boost, or to get your passing grade for the course for your transcript. So these are all things to think about.
Alrighty. Yep,
All right.
that's it. I'm heading off.
So, all right. So I've got office hours at 3. If you've got individual questions, I'll be back here next Tuesday to do the last set of notes for the course, and that's pretty much going to be it.
All right. Well, you stay safe, Salmon.
All right. You as
All
well, Owen. You all take care.
All right.
You
Yeah,
too.
take care.
Bye, guys.
Later.
Uh-huh.
See you.
Yep.